It's true that we are what we eat. Sports and nutrition scientist Tim Noakes is back with a brand new cookbook, The Eat Right Revolution. There's this one over here. Like the real meal revolution before it, Noakes' new diet book is all about living a healthier, longer life. The new book zeroes in on cheap and effective ways to tackle the root causes of chronic illness and comorbidity. Once again, it stresses that we all have the power to take on our health issues without relying on drugs and flawed science. Starting with what we eat. Tim Noakes joins me now to talk more about his new cookbook. Tim, very good morning to you. So how do we live a longer and better life?
Well, Jane, if you'd asked me that 15 years ago, I wouldn't have known the answer. And it's only through personal experience and the literature, reading the literature, realizing that we're beginning to realize that something like 80% of chronic disease, which we call disease of lifestyle, are actually disease of nutrition. And that's the problem is that this is kind of not accepted very widely. And our message is to the individual to say, listen, look around and see how healthy people look. And if you think that they don't look as healthy as they might, or if you're experiencing any of a range of conditions which I describe in the book, you may have this condition, insulin resistance, which is the most prevalent medical condition on the globe, but we don't teach about it. And if you are insulin resistant, you're at risk of diabetes, obesity, and various other diseases like hypertension and so on. And the only way you can address it, the only way you can effectively address it, is to reduce the carbohydrate content of the diet and to shift from a diet which is made of predominantly of industrial type foods that we eat and which we buy at the supermarket. And we need to go back to the diet that humans evolved to eat, which is eating animals in their natural state, as it were. The Industrial Revolution has changed our diet, and that diet is the cause of all these conditions I've described.
And how are you pushing it on in this book? Because I know it was quite dramatic when you decided that actually it's the other way around when it comes to fat and carbohydrates. But what more have you learned in writing this book and how it plays out under the COVID scenario?
Well, thank you. What we realized was that very early on in the evolution of this disease, we realized that obesity was a major risk factor for COVID, but it's not obesity. It's obese cells within the viscera, whether it's in the organs of the body. So when you store fat, if you have a diet that is too full in calories and too poor in nutrients, and you overeat the calories, you store the fat either underneath your skin, and we call that subcutaneous fat, or you store it in the viscera, in the abdomen, and we call that visceral obesity. Storing it under the surface of the skin is fine. It doesn't seem to have any long-term consequence, but if you store it in the viscera, that's a real problem because those visceral fat cells become a hive of inflammation, and they make the person continuously inflamed. Now, what the virus does, it uses that inflammation and it targets those cells and makes you more inflamed. And that is why people with visceral obesity are at something like 10-fold greater risk of developing fatal COVID infections. Now, there's only one way to reverse visceral obesity. Only one way. There is no drug on the planet that can do that. The only thing that can do it is to cut the carbohydrates. And I might add the one change we have realized is that you have to limit a little bit the fat in your diet and replace some of the fat with protein. So we don't really discuss that because it's new information. However, it's clear that the first thing you have to do is you must cut the refined carbohydrates and stop eating the industrial diet, which is highly addictive and which causes us to eat too many calories. We store those calories in our visceral fat, our body becomes inflamed, and then we get all these chronic diseases that we mentioned.
Okay, Tim, I mean, I tried it. I did it for a year. I felt good in it, but at the end I couldn't see meat or fat or anything like that. And doing a lot of sport, I found that the more carbohydrates, like, rice or, the good ones I introduced, I felt better. How do you balance what you are saying with exercise, which I know is also important, and with people increasingly moving away from proteins and meats?
Well, they aren't actually. The sale of meat increased 40% in the United Kingdom last year. So the move towards meat is increasing. It's not moving away from it. That's a vegan story, which is not true. And that's being driven as part of a global movement to eat a plant-based diet, which is also driven by other factors which we won't discuss today. But the reality is that humans are moving back to meat. They're not moving away from it. But to answer your question, you see, you may be insulin resistant, not insulin resistant, and that therefore you can afford to eat some carbohydrate. What I like to tell people is that I'm 70, and once you get to 70, the sins of your diet really catch up with you. And it's a bit late then to start realizing that you shouldn't have eaten all those carbohydrates. So that's the reality. And point one. Point two, you say that you have to need carbohydrates for exercise. That's actually not true. Some of the world's greatest athletes are eating high-fat, higher protein, low-carbohydrate diets and doing extremely well on it. But again, it depends if you're insulin resistant. If you're insulin resistant and you eat carbohydrates, you're going to get into trouble later on. And that's our message. So find out if you're insulin resistant. You apparently are not insulin resistant, and you can cope with an increased carbohydrate intake. But we estimate that only about 20% of the population are in your fortunate case. The rest of us, like myself, have degrees of insulin resistance. And I'm the most insulin resistant, and I developed type 2 diabetes eating the diet that you're eating. And we now know that diabetes is a massive problem in this country, and we need to address it. We need to tell people that there are now in excess of 15 studies showing that if you have type 2 diabetes, it is a reversible disease in some people. You can put it into remission. You can stop requiring medication. You can control your blood glucose levels purely by restricting the carbohydrate in your diet. But you have to restrict a lot. And that's the message we're trying to get out, that for individuals like yourself, yes, carry on eating the way you want to if your weight is well controlled and you don't have visceral obesity. But if you're insulin resistant and you're developing visceral obesity, all the exercise in the world and all the medication isn't going to help. Until you get rid of that visceral obesity, you are at risk of a wide range of different medical conditions.
Well, you certainly look good for your age, Tim, and it's been a fascinating read. Thank you very much for talking to us.